He turned to leave, but something stopped him. A voice, low, almost a whisper, spoke his name from the darkness. "Don't go." The boy's blood ran cold. He didn't need to look to know it wasn't his mother's voice. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. Something far older and far more dangerous. His heart pounded in his chest as the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward him with an unnatural force. And that's when he realized the real nightmare was just beginning. What happens next? Does he escape? Or does he discover that some things should never be brought back? Stay tuned. The boy's feet barely made a sound as he turned toward the voice, a voice that sent a chill down his spine. He didn't want to, but his body betrayed him. He had to look. He had to know who, or what, was speaking to him. He stood there in the dim light of the morgue, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice was soft, almost like a breath against his ear, but the words were unmistakable. "Don't go." The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and a deep sense of dread settled over him. This wasn't right. His mother's body was still lying on the cold slab, her face pale and lifeless, yet something about the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt heavier now, charged with an unseen energy. He felt as if the walls themselves were closing in, and a creeping darkness seemed to press against him from all sides. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, twisting into shapes that almost seemed alive. And in that moment, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Was the liquid in the vial really a way to reconnect with his mother, or had he unwittingly unleashed something far worse? His mind raced back to the days leading up to her death. His mother had been sick for a long time, but she had never given up. Even when the doctors said there was nothing they could do, she had fought, clinging to life with a strength he had admired. But despite all the love and care that surrounded her, death had eventually claimed her. The pain of losing her had been too much to bear. She was the only family he had left. His father was never in the picture, and his relatives had long since disappeared. It was always just the two of them, and now that she was gone, the boy felt utterly alone in the world. But that didn't explain what was happening now. He had come to the morgue with one goal in mind, to bring her back, even if just for a moment, to hear her voice again, to feel her warmth. He had heard the stories, the whispers among the older members of his community. They talked about rituals, about things long forgotten, about the possibility of reaching beyond the grave. But no one had ever said it would feel like this. The boy's breath caught in his throat as he turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. There was nothing. The morgue was as still and silent as it had been before. He stepped forward cautiously, every nerve in his body alert, ready for something, anything, to happen. But as he moved closer to his mother's body again, something shifted in the shadows. He heard it, a rustling, like something brushing against the floor. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, but it grew louder, more distinct. He looked around, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. His eyes landed on a figure in the corner of the room. It was shadowed, its form indistinct, but there was no mistaking the shape. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an unnatural stillness to its posture. The boy's heart skipped a beat as the figure slowly began to move, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. What is that?" The boy whispered to himself, his voice shaking. He didn't know if he was imagining it, or if this was something real, something that had been lying dormant until now. But one thing was clear, he wasn't alone. And whatever this thing was, it wasn't friendly. The figure took another step toward him, its movement slow and deliberate. With each step, the air seemed to grow colder, the darkness deeper. The boy stumbled backward, his mind racing for answers, but none came. All he could think about was getting out of this room, away from whatever had just been awakened by his actions. But he couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, and his breath came in shallow gasps. It was as though the room itself was holding him captive, preventing him from escaping. The shadows grew longer, and he could feel the presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment. His hand instinctively reached for the vial again, clutching it tightly. The liquid inside seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, a reminder of what had brought him here. He thought about his mother, about how much he had loved her, about how much he needed her. But as the figure drew closer, the boy began to realize something. This wasn't just about his mother. This was about something far more dangerous. Something that had been lying dormant for years, something tied to his family's history, something that had been awakened by his desperate attempt to reach beyond the grave. The figure's mouth opened, revealing a row of shark teeth that gleamed in the dim light. The boy froze in place, his eyes locked on the creature, unable to look away. It stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, and the boy could feel a weight on his chest, as though the very air was pressing against him. "I warned you," the figure whispered, its voice low and guttural. "You should never have tried to bring her back." The boy's heart pounded, his body trembling with fear. He had no idea what this thing was, but he knew it wasn't his mother. It wasn't even human. It was something older, something more dangerous, and it had been waiting for him. The shadows seemed to close in on him, and he felt himself being pulled toward the creature. Panic surged through him, and for the first time, he realized that the vial of liquid, his last hope, might not save him. It might have done more harm than good. He wasn't just dealing with grief anymore. He was dealing with something far more sinister. The boy's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, but the creature was too close now, its cold, hollow eyes fixed on him. He reached into his pocket for anything, any weapon, but his fingers found nothing. His hand trembled around the vial, and for a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. The creature was inches away, its breath cold against his skin. But then, as if by some miracle, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into total darkness. The boy's heart stopped. He heard a sound, footsteps, soft and distant, yet unmistakable. It wasn't the creature. Someone else was coming. Who was it? Was it a friend, or was it another danger lurking in the shadows? The boy's thoughts were a blur as he tried to make sense of the situation. His chest tightened, and the fear that had taken hold of him moments ago began to build again, stronger than ever. The presence of the figure was overwhelming, but now there was something else to worry about, someone else, and he had no idea who they were. What was happening to him? What was happening to the world around him? And more importantly, was he going to make it out alive? The steps grew louder, closer. The boy's breath quickened. He didn't know who it was, but he had a feeling that they weren't here to help. The room felt like it was closing in on him. Something was coming, something that would change everything. Would the boy survive the night, or would he become a part of the darkness that had been awakened? The answers were closer than he realized. The boy's heart raced as the footsteps grew louder, closer. The room seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing down like a weight on his chest. He didn't know who was approaching, but he had no time to think. His eyes darted around, trying to find an escape, but the shadows swallowed up every corner. He could feel the presence of the creature still looming in the dark, its cold eyes locked on him. It was waiting. Then the lights flickered again, and for a moment, the entire morgue was plunged into absolute darkness. The boy held his breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. The footsteps had stopped. He couldn't tell if the creature had moved, or if it was still watching him. But something else, something more urgent, was happening. He heard the faintest whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably human. "Stay still." It wasn't the creature. The voice was soft, soothing, yet edged with something he couldn't quite place. It sounded familiar, though, like the voice of someone he knew, someone he could trust. But how could that be? Everyone he knew was gone. Before he could even process what was happening, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a person, but not just anyone. A man, tall and imposing, his face shadowed by the dim light. The boy's eyes widened in shock as recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. It was his uncle, someone he hadn't seen in years. But his uncle had died. He remembered the funeral, the way the family had all gathered to say their goodbyes. It couldn't be him. "Uncle," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he moved swiftly toward the creature, his presence like a wall between the boy and the danger that lurked in the shadows. The boy felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. What was happening? Why was his uncle here, and why did he look different? "You should never have come here," the figure, his uncle, said quietly, his voice low, almost a growl. "You've opened a door that should have remained shut." The boy's head spun. "What do you mean? What's going on?" The uncle's face remained impassive, but his eyes, those cold, familiar eyes, betrayed a sadness the boy had never seen before. "Your mother wasn't just a woman. She had something inside her, something that should never have been disturbed. And you, by trying to bring her back, have awakened forces far older than you realize." The boy's mind reeled. "What do you mean? She was my mom. I just wanted to see her again, just once more." "What are you talking about?" The uncle stepped closer, his eyes locking onto the boy's with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "She was more than just your mother. She carried a legacy, one tied to an ancient power. A power that has been passed down through generations. That liquid, you thought it would bring her back, but it was never meant to be used. It's a binding agent, a key to something far darker. And now you've unlocked it." The boy's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what his uncle was talking about. He had just wanted to hear his mother's voice again, to feel her touch one last time. But now it felt like everything was falling apart, like the ground beneath him was crumbling away. Suddenly, the creature took a step forward, its grotesque form moving into the dim light. The boy's uncle didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand, and a burst of energy crackled in the air, a sharp, bright light that illuminated the entire morgue. The creature recoiled, its skin sizzling as though burned by the light. "Leave this place," the uncle commanded. His voice was deep, authoritative, but it was laced with something the boy hadn't noticed before: fear. The creature hissed, its eyes narrowing in fury, but it didn't move. The boy could see now that it wasn't human. It was something twisted, a being born of shadow and darkness. It was ancient, far older than anything he could comprehend. "You can't stop it," the creature hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers all at once. "Once it is unleashed, it cannot be undone." The boy's uncle didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his body trembling as if straining against an invisible force. The air in the room shifted, swirling with a strange energy. The boy could feel it, the pull of something deep within the earth, something that was tugging at him, calling to him. "Run," his uncle shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "Get out now." Without thinking, the boy turned and bolted for the door. His legs moved on their own, his heart racing as the world seemed to blur around him. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to leave. He had to escape the madness that had gripped him. He ran, his breath ragged, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He didn't dare look back, not even when he heard the sound of the creature's roar, a sound that made his blood run cold. As he pushed through the door and into the night air, The world outside seemed to come back into focus. The sky was dark, the stars hidden behind a veil of clouds. He could still feel the weight of the morgue pressing on him, like a nightmare that wouldn't let go. He collapsed against the wall, his body trembling. He couldn't believe what had just happened. His mother, his uncle, the creature, it was all too much. But then, as the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of what he had done sank in. He had tried to bring his mother back, and in doing so, he had unleashed something far darker than he could have ever imagined. Something that was now free, something that could never be put back. He wasn't sure if he was safe. He wasn't sure if anyone was. But one thing was clear, the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. And as he stood there in the quiet of the night, he realized that he would never be the same again. What he had done, what he had unlocked, would haunt him for the rest of his life. And as the wind howled in the distance, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Waiting. The darkness had found its way out. Asterisk, asterisk, a black boy broke into the morgue and poured liquid into his deceased mother's mouth. Asterisk, asterisk. The air was thick with tension as the clock ticked into the dead of night. It was a time when most people were nestled in their beds, unaware of the darkness unfolding just a few miles away. But for one boy, sleep was the least of his concerns. His heart raced, his hands trembled, and his mind was consumed by one singular thought. He had to do this. The morgue, a cold, sterile place where the forgotten rest, stood ominously in the distance. The dull glow of streetlights barely illuminated the path ahead as the boy made his way toward it. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. Every step he took was one closer to the unthinkable. To most, the idea of entering a morgue was a nightmare. But for him, it was a mission, one born from desperation and love. His mother had been gone for days. She had left this world in a way that no one could have prepared for, and the grief that consumed him was unbearable. But there was something more, a sense of unfinished business, a feeling that she hadn't truly left, not entirely. The doctors had called it closure. They had said she was gone, her spirit departed. But to him, the silence spoke volumes. He couldn't let go. Not yet. The boy's breath came in short, shallow bursts as he approached the heavy steel doors of the morgue. He had no plan, no exact idea of how to get inside. But he didn't need one. His heart was his guide. He had seen the look in his mother's eyes before she passed, the way she had tried to speak, but the words never came. He had to make sure she wasn't alone, that she didn't leave without hearing what he had to say. And then there was the liquid. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself. It was something he had found, a strange, almost mystical substance that had been in his family for generations. It was said to have the power to bring the dead back for just a moment, to let them hear you, to let them know you're still here, still trying to reach them. It was all he had left, hope, love, and that mysterious vial of liquid. But as he pushed through the doors of the morgue, he realized something. The tension wasn't just in his chest anymore. It was in the air surrounding him. The morgue wasn't empty. There was something else here, something hidden in the shadows, watching him as he moved deeper into the sterile hallways. It felt as if the walls themselves were closing in. And yet, he couldn't turn back. He had come this far. As he approached the room where his mother lay, cold and still, a sense of dread washed over him. This wasn't just a mother-son moment anymore. This was something far more profound. He had heard the stories, the whispers about what happens when the boundary between life and death is crossed, about the dangerous games people play with the unknown. But he couldn't stop. His hand tightened around the vial as he stepped closer to the cold, lifeless body of the woman who had given him life. His fingers hovered over her lips, the same lips that had once whispered stories of love and warmth, now silent and unmoving. He poured the liquid gently, just enough for her to feel it, to know he was still here. He needed to feel her presence once more, to hear her voice, to know that even in death, she was still his mother. But then something strange happened. The air grew colder. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, to twist into shapes that shouldn't be. A faint noise echoed from somewhere deep within the morgue, a low, almost imperceptible whisper, like the faintest breath on the back of his neck. He froze, every muscle in his body rigid. The liquid had barely touched her lips, yet something was happening. The room felt alive in a way it hadn't before. The boy's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, waiting for a sign, anything to show that his actions hadn't been in vain. Then slowly a movement. Her fingers twitched. The boy's breath caught in his throat. He backed away, his mind spinning. He wasn't sure if he had seen what he thought he saw. Could it be? Could she be coming back? His mind raced. His emotions were a whirlwind. Hope, fear, doubt, and desperation all collided inside him. Was this what he had been waiting for, or was it something far worse? Something that could not and should not be disturbed. And then, as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The room returned to its eerie silence, the shadows no longer moving, the chill in the air dissipating. The boy stood frozen, unsure of what to do next, his mind still grappling with what had just occurred. Had he really seen it? Was it just his grief playing tricks on him, or had he actually brought her back, even for a moment? But the question that lingered in his mind, the one he couldn't shake, was this: what had he truly awakened?